Although it was a simple aircraft with modest performance, the de Havilland Vampire was a big success for the company. Over 3,200 were sold in a decade long production run. It also proved to be a decent fighter bomber in the 31 air arms that flew it. For the vast majority of them, it was the first jet fighter in their inventory and represented a big step up in performance over the war era piston engined fighters it replaced. But the performance of jet fighters was moving on at a startling pace. The Vampire entered service in 1946 with a 2,700 pound Force Goblin 1, soon upgraded to a 3,100 pound Goblin 2. By 1948, fighters like the Panther were entering service with versions of the Rolls-Royce Nene, offering over 5,000 pounds of force, rapidly growing towards 6,000 in the MiG-15 bis. The weight of these aircraft grew, as did their performance. Vampires were low 500-mile-an-hour range fighters. Larger, more powerful straight-winged aircraft added at least 50 miles an hour to that mark. The swept-wing Sabre and MiG-15 were capable of between 650 and 700 miles an hour, depending on the version. More performance was required if the Vampire family was to remain competitive over the battlefield and on the export market into the 1950s. De Havilland was an oddity in that they produced both the engine and the airframe around it. They had developed a more powerful jet called the Ghost, and in 1947 they fitted it to a Vampire T1, which, with slightly extended wingtips, was able to climb to a remarkable 59,500 feet, nearly 20,000 feet above the realistic ceiling of the Goblin version. The Ghost developed 4,850 pounds of force, but it was evident that to make the most of its power in the lightweight Vampire meant improving its relatively primitive aerodynamics. The Air Ministry agreed, and on the 14th of September 1949 they issued a new operational requirement to de Havilland for a thin-winged version of the Vampire. Some other changes were required, most obviously to the shape of the Vampire's laminated plywood nacelle to fit in the larger diameter engine. Common to other British fighters of the day, it featured a Rotax cartridge starter, resulting in dramatic clouds of black smoke on startup. In fact, starting the Venom could be quite a dramatic process, as the Ghost was prone to wet starts, resulting in a very large flame being shot out of the exhaust. NATO allies must have wondered quite what the crazy Brits had brought to their base when a line of Venoms started up. Anyhow, the main change from the Vampire was the wing, which was a radical departure. It featured a 17.6-degree leading edge sweep and reduced the thickness to chord ratio from 14% to 10%. The trailing edge was straight. The change essentially trades lift for reduced transonic drag. 75-gallon wingtip tanks were fitted, and the tailplane strengthened to allow it to function at speeds up to 650 miles an hour. Wingspan increased by 3.5 feet to 41 feet and 8 inches. Wing area was up only slightly, though, 279 square feet versus 262 on the previous Vampire FB5. The scale of the changes was such that everyone decided it was time for a new name, always good for marketing purposes. De Havilland were obviously having a V phase at the time, so they named the Vampire FB8 the Venom. The rest of the aircraft was essentially a Vampire. Main armament was 4 Hispano-Suiza 20mm cannons with 150 rounds per gun, which was good. 2 1,000-pound bombs or 8 60-pound rockets could also be carried under the wings. There was, however, still no ejector seat, which was bad, as safely bailing out of a jet fighter in any realistic operational scenario would be very challenging. The prototype first flew on the 2nd of September 1949. Although it clearly had potential, there were a number of issues to be resolved with the design. Most notably, at 40,000 feet and 0.85 Mach, the trim would abruptly change nose down, whereas when that speed was reached at 20,000 feet, the nose would suddenly trim up. At 10,000 feet, the rudder vibrated severely about 0.8 Mach, and roll rate was poor all round. Correcting all of this involved lightening the control surfaces, adding a leading edge droop to the wing, increasing the size of the air brake, reducing the angle that the flaps could be deployed to, and then developing a wingtip slat arrangement. Although for the most part these modifications corrected the control issues, as the initial batch of 6 pre production examples were constructed and tested, each appeared to exhibit different severity and forms of instability. The cause turned out to be linked to how the wing surface deteriorated in use. The tools and skills needed to manufacture and maintain jet fighters were every bit as important as the smarts used to design them in this period. And especially the tooling was an area in which the British establishment struggled in this time. Efforts to strengthen the wing structure continued for the first year of operational use. Early aircraft were painted with broad orange bands to signify that they could only maneuver in a restricted manner, but eventually strengthened wing root structures were retrofitted to these aircraft and everything was fine. Despite all of the problems, the RAF was happy with the Venom FB-1. In testing, it supposedly demonstrated superior dogfight performance to any other fighter in the inventory, including the F-86 Sabre. Deliveries to frontline squadrons started in July 1952. 375 were built over the next 2.5 years, with the last delivery on the 29th of December 1954. From early in that year, ejector seats were fitted to Venoms, much to the approval of pilots. Germany-based fighter wings within 2 ATAF received the type in August 1952, starting with 123 Squadron at Wunstorf, and then 121 Wing at Fasberg and 139 at Celle, formed in the early part of 1954. In the NATO arsenal, it fit between the heavy, long-range strike capabilities of the Thunderjet and the transonic air superiority role of the Sabre. It was a true fighter bomber. Climb rate proved to be excellent, and because it was small and light, its turning ability in general was good. Above 35,000 feet, it was judged to be better than the Sabre. As an interceptor, though, it fundamentally lacked the speed to be effective. This weakness also meant that an astute pilot of a swept-wing aircraft would be able to dictate the timing in terms of an engagement with a Venom. For this reason, the Venom's real strength was in ground attack. It was a small target and it was agile, enabling its pilot to place ordnance with great accuracy. Lightweight and good fuel capacity gave it a decent endurance as well. In the event of a shooting war with the Soviet bloc, it would have been employed as a deep, close air support platform, seeking out convoys and attacking small bridges to interdict supply lines. Venoms never acquired nuclear capability. Frankly, they were too small to carry the tactical weapons of the time. But since the most potent US strike aircraft were being assigned to the nuclear mission, Venoms would have played a vital role if the conflict had not gone immediately nuclear in the days after the initial tactical exchange. In the early days, they would have faced MiG-15s and MiG-17s over the battlefield. Towards the end of their career in Germany, MiG-19s were entering the service of Soviet frontal aviation. Although the Venom was not fast enough to actively hunt any of those aircraft, its agility at low levels would have made it a frustrating and potentially a dangerous adversary for those fighters had they encountered each other. Success of the FB-1 led to an upgraded FB-4. The main change on this version was the addition of hydraulically powered ailerons to improve control at higher Mach numbers. Detailed changes were made to the shape of the control surfaces, and the ability to carry drop tanks in addition to the tip tanks was added. 151 were delivered between March 1955 and March 1956. The only Germany-based wing to get them was 123 at Wunstorf. Although it might seem strange to be still buying straight-wing fighters in the middle 1950s, the RAF felt they had no real choice, as the development of fighter-bomber hunters had been slower than planned. Those aircraft did begin to replace Germany-based Venoms in 1956 and 57. Most Venoms then went to the Middle East and other postings around the empire, such as Cyprus and Singapore, replacing Vampires in most cases. Venoms therefore participated in Suez in 1956, striking ground targets. 1 aircraft was lost to ground fire. MiGs didn't appear to challenge them, which is in some ways a shame, as it would have been interesting to know how well the Venom would have performed against the MiG-15. Throughout the 1950s, Venoms supported troops fighting insurgencies in Aden and Malaya, serving alongside Australian Sabres at Butterworth. They were also deployed to Hong Kong, flying border patrols to keep tabs on China. Number 28 Squadron, tasked with that mission, was actually the last RAF squadron to surrender its Venoms in 1962. Hunters replaced them as they had superseded Venoms in most other postings. There were some export customers for the Venom, but it was most loved by the Swiss, whose Air Force continued to operate them until 1983. The single-seat Venom was a short-lived fighter in frontline NATO service. Its innovative, lightweight, partly laminate construction made it relatively cheap and fast to make, but it also led to structural issues with the airframe that, alongside the rapid progress towards supersonic fighters, made the type obsolete as a frontline aircraft in short order. The most direct point of comparison for it is the French Dassault Ouragan. The Venom is clearly superior in most aspects to that aircraft, and of course it should be, because it was the product of an experienced aviation industry rather than one rebuilding from scratch. Just as the Mystère rapidly put an end to the Ouragan's career, once the Hunter came on the scene, there was little point in retaining the Venom. Hunter had far superior thrust to weight, a lower wing loading, heavier armament, and so on and so forth. So there isn't much more to say about the Venom, really. It was cheap, robust, and easy to operate. It filled a requirement in defending vestiges of Britain's waning empire in the 1950s for less money than the advanced second-generation fighters that succeeded it. It also played a useful role in an increasingly nuclear strike-oriented NATO in Europe. This was an age of interim aircraft that filled a need for a few years while technology advanced. As I've said before, we have to be careful not to assess such aircraft as failures. Our vantage point is $100 million airframes that last for decades. Here we are talking about simple fighters in which dynamic performance remained the principal arbiter of combat effectiveness. Judged in that light, then, the Venom, like the Vampire, was a modest success. To quote the NATO headquarters' 1958 assessment, the Venom FB4 is probably the best fighter bomber in its class in the world. Maybe only for that year, but sometimes a year is enough.